Hello everyone, thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, you might as well listen to this story, and maybe you will fall asleep soon. Before listening, please like and subscribe first. Of course, the premise is that you really like my content. If you have any thoughts or feelings, please leave a message below. Your opinions will really help me grow. Okay, enough chit-chat. Let's get started. At 5:58 in the morning, my pager went off beneath my pillow. The Van Horn residence in the Central Park West Villa area. The captain's voice was as harsh as sandpaper rubbing against a microphone. The wealthy Edward Van Horn has disappeared, and a ransom note was left at the scene. You must arrive within half an hour. I clutched the pager tightly and got out of bed. The black and white photo of my father on the bedside table was staring at me. He had just been buried 3 days ago. At the funeral, the director patted me on the shoulder and said, "Little Jane, it's time to take over the work of the serious crime team." Now this phone call is my first battle to prove that I don't rely on my father's connections. At 6:12, I stood in front of the iron gate of the Van Horn residence. The security system of the 3 electronic doors flashed cold lights, and the butler, old Colin, was still shaking. I last saw the gentleman at 10 o'clock last night. He said he was going to read the financial report in the study. The alarm sounded at 6 o'clock this morning. We rushed in, but he was gone. There was a note on the walnut desk in the study. I pulled it out with my gloves on. The handwriting on it was crooked, as if it was written with my non-dominant hand. $50 million. Be ready by midnight tomorrow, or I'll tear it up. Where's the surveillance? I asked.
Old Colin moved his Adam's apple. We checked the entry and exit records of the 3 doors. At 0017, the first door was opened for 3 seconds. The system showed it was Mr.'s fingerprint. At 0019, the second door. The same fingerprint at 021, the third door. But in the surveillance at these 3 time points, the doors were open but no one was there. I tightened the fingers that were holding the note. With triple security of fingerprint lock, iris recognition, and thermal imaging monitoring, can the kidnappers make the system mistakenly think that Edward opened the door himself, but leave no trace in the monitoring? My eyes swept across the desk and saw a black notebook half exposed outside the drawer. The cover is worn and looks like a frequently used item. I opened it. It was blank. "Butler, is this the gentleman's notebook?" "It should be." Old Colin took a closer look. He always said that some things are safer to remember in the mind than on paper. So this notebook, maybe it's useless.
I didn't speak. He took the ransom note out of the evidence bag and scanned it against the blank page of the notepad. As soon as my fingertips touched the paper, the notebook suddenly vibrated. The light gray handwriting looked like it had been soaked in developer, and the words Van Horn, $50 million, and 017 appeared. A red circle exploded next to $50 million, which made me squint. My heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary notepad. "Agent Marlowe." Old Colin's voice drew my attention back. I quickly closed the book and stuffed it into the evidence bag. "Have the technical department arrived? Detective Rivera is checking the surveillance." Tony Rivera's curly-haired face poked out from the end of the corridor, a USB drive clutched in his hand. He is my college classmate and the youngest hacker in the technical department. He will stutter if he looks at someone for more than 3 seconds. "The surveillance has been altered." He slapped a USB drive in my hand. All cameras were delayed by 0.3 seconds between 017 and 021. It's like some program erased the real footage and replaced it with a looping empty shot. "What procedure?" "The encryption protocol of the private cloud disk." He pushed his glasses up, his Adam's apple moving as if he had swallowed a marble. "The money laundering case on Wall Street 3 years ago also used this method to cover up the transfer records." I stared at the flashing surveillance footage in the USB drive. At 017, the electronic door opened and closed. The picture flashed, but it was still an empty corridor. Who has access to Van Horn's private cloud drive? Tony shook his head. I don't know, but... He suddenly lowered his voice. This protocol requires the biometric information authorization of the cloud disk owner. Biometric information. I remembered the fingerprint records of the 3 gates. When I turned around, the silver medicine box on the desk caught my eye. Edward has severe diabetes and needs to take insulin every day. I opened the medicine box and found 7 pens neatly arranged inside. The dosage scale of the 6th pen stopped at 40 units. The normal dose is 12. Old Colin, did the sir take his insulin last night? Yes, the housekeeper nodded. Every day at 10:30. I watched him do it. What's the dosage? I didn't notice it. He rubbed his hands, but the gentleman adjusted it himself. He said his blood sugar has been unstable recently. 40 units are enough to kill him. I took out the black notebook and opened it. Abnormal insulin dosage automatically popped up on the blank page, and the red circle flashed again. On the way back to the police station, I spread my notepad on my lap. The $50 million and 40 units of insulin in the red circle suddenly began to move, as if being pulled by an invisible hand, and formed a line on the paper. New words appeared next to it. Kidnapping requires the victim to be alive. Lethal dose contradiction. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. All the clues were reassembled in the notebook. The timeline, character relationships, and contradictions clicked together like puzzle pieces. This kidnapping case may not have been intended to make people believe it was a kidnapping from the beginning. The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an anonymous text message with only 6 words. Don't trust Lucas. Lucas Van Horn, Edward's adopted son. I met him at a charity dinner 3 days ago. He was wearing a dark grey suit, and kept his eyes downcast when he spoke, like a cat with its claws retracted. The notebook suddenly vibrated again. The words Lucas Van Horn rose from the bottom of the page, forming a triangle with $50 million and insulin dose. The red circle exploded in the center of the triangle, stinging my eyes so much that they hurt. I stepped on the accelerator. Lucas is a curator at the Van Horn family's private art gallery in Brooklyn. It's time to meet this adopted son, I said to myself in the rearview mirror. The wind blew in through the car window, rustling the pages of the notebook. I hope the secrets you hide are enough for me to tear open the curtain of this drama. As I pulled up outside the Brooklyn Museum, the metal gate creaked open. Lucas was wearing a light beige sweater and holding a rag in his hand, as if he had just finished wiping the display cabinet. Detective Jane. He looked up and smiled, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes. You came just in time. I just finished sorting out my father's collection of Tiffany antique brooches. I flashed my ID. I need to see your dashcam data from 3 days ago. Without asking why, he turned around and pulled out a silver USB flash drive from under the display cabinet. I installed 2 cameras in the garage, one in the front and one in the back. When his knuckles rubbed the USB flash drive interface, I noticed an old scar on his left little finger, as if it was scratched by a sharp object. When the projector came on, all the lights in the gallery went out. The picture shows the north side of the Brooklyn Bridge late at night with dim street lights and cracks on the concrete ground. The passenger door was opened, and Edward Van Horn, wearing a dark grey bathrobe, bent over and sat in. Adjust the timestamp. My throat tightened. 23:17. The kidnapping occurred at 0:12 a.m. the next day, when the alarm of the villa in Central Park West sounded. Father said he wanted to see the moon in the old neighborhood. Lucas's voice floated from behind. He has been saying recently that wealth traps people in a glass case. I turned around and asked, wearing a bathrobe at 11 o'clock in the morning, to come to a place like this. He didn't respond, but tapped the projection screen with his fingertips. Look, he touched the rear bumper before getting in the car. That was the secret code he taught me when I was a kid. If you touch a dent, it means it's safe. I took out my notebook. and a red circle with the words "Edward took the initiative to get in the car" immediately popped up on the blank page. Just as I was about to ask more, the side door of the art gallery was pushed open. Mrs. Clare was carrying a wicker lunchbox, and her pearl earrings flashed in the darkness. "Detective Jane." She put the lunchbox on the display case, and the aroma of chocolate mixed with Chanel No. 5 drifted over. "Lucas always said that you solve cases like solving puzzles." I baked brownies. I stared at her cuffs. On the off-white silk, a .5 carat diamond was embroidered into a miniature totem, and the stitches were so fine that it looked like they were embroidered under a microscope. "Edward has been saying lately that someone is investigating his father's old accounts." She lifted the lid of the lunchbox. "Last week, when he asked his lawyer to transfer his overseas assets, he also said, 'We should save the spark for a real crisis.'" I picked up a piece of brownie. "What crisis?" "The diamond robbery 30 years ago." She curved her lips, painted with bean paste-colored lipstick. "You know, the Van Horn family made their fortune with those South African diamonds. But after the robbery, the key to old Van Horn's safe was never found again." I took a bite of the brownie and it was bittersweet. The notepad vibrated in my pocket, telling me that Claire mentioned an old case. When we returned to the police station, Tony was eating a burger with his feet on the computer case. I slammed the USB drive onto his keyboard. "Check for frame rate drift and audio noise." "Okay." He held the burger in his mouth and took the USB drive. "After you left, I hacked into the Van Horn family's access control system, the fingerprint records of the 3 doors. The last person to use it was Edward himself. When the display lights up, the dash cam footage starts skipping frames." Tony tapped the keyboard twice. "This is a 24-frame video. There are 0.3 extra frames here. It's like a photo was inserted between 2 videos." After the audio file was amplified 40 times, a buzzing sound similar to the flapping of bee wings was heard. Tony pushed up his glasses. "This is infrasonic encryption. We need to use an old Van Horn insulin pen as a decoder. I've seen the same one in their medicine boxes." My phone vibrated. It was a text message from Elliot. "Come to the lab. There's a surprise." He shook the centrifuge tube, and the blood sample inside was a strange purple. "There is a trace amount of scopolamine in Edward's blood, which can make people confused, but maintain the ability to move. Combined with the 40 units of insulin." He snapped his fingers. "Someone wants him to die naturally during the kidnapping process, and they can also disguise it as complications of diabetes." I squeezed the centrifuge tube tightly, but he took the initiative to get into Lucas's car. "So this isn't kidnapping." Elliot pushed his white coat. "It was Edward who helped him disappear. Someone drugged him, adjusted his insulin, and used kidnapping as a cover. When he dies, they can transfer his assets with a clear conscience." Back in the office, I opened my notebook. The words "Edward voluntarily disappeared" glowed green, and a diamond symbol suddenly appeared next to Lucas's name, exactly the same as the diamond totem on Claire's cuff. It started to rain outside the window, and the raindrops hit the glass, turning the symbols into blurry spots of light. I finally understood why Edward's security system failed, and why the kidnappers were able to get through 3 doors. The screenwriter of this play has never been an outsider. The phone vibrated on the table, indicating a missed call. The number was encrypted, and the call time showed that 24 hours had passed since the report was made. I wiped the rain off the notebook, and the diamond symbol slowly seeped onto the wet paper like drops of solidified blood. The phone screen was blindingly bright, and as soon as the number of the missed call was crossed out, the alarm in the bureau went off. "Marlowe," Old Hawk yelled from the office next door. "The kidnappers have changed their tactics." The captain was turning his computer towards me as I rushed over. Edward Van Horn's official Twitter account just posted a new update, with a picture of his ancestral diamond cufflinks, pressed on a yellowed newspaper clipping, with the title, "Van Horn Diamond Robbery, Mysterious Death of the Father of the Richest Man." If you don't want the scandal to be exposed, Reveal the truth about the robbery within 48 hours. The caption only had this sentence, and it was sent 3 minutes ago. The lights in the conference room suddenly lit up. I was drawing a timeline on the whiteboard with a marker when the FBI guys pushed in. Roy Thornton, the negotiation expert who always polished his cufflinks to a shine, glanced at the words self-directed and self-acted. I wrote and sneered, "Detective, this is a transnational blackmail case, not the time for you to play jigsaw puzzles." I didn't respond, but turned around and took out my phone to send a message to Tony. He replied quickly, "See you in the lab in 5 minutes." The air conditioning in the server room made the back of my neck feel cold. When Tony turned the screen toward me, the red dot on the IP address map was pinned to the Cayman Islands, the Van Horn family's overseas financial server. The tweet uses Edward's biometric key to log in. He tapped the keyboard. Fingerprint, iris, mosh waste print, triple verification, unless someone can copy all three at the same time. Or maybe it was him, I interrupted. Tony pulled at the wrinkled collar of his shirt. What's even more amazing is that this server contains records of his transfer of 90% of his assets last Wednesday, which was 3 days before he was kidnapped. My puzzle book is getting hot in my pocket. When I opened it, the 2 red circles of asset transfer and old case exposure were slowly overlapping. "Detective Marlowe?" Angela Wu's voice came over the intercom. "There's a problem with the weight of the ransom box." The door of the evidence department's warehouse creaked. When I lifted the tarpaulin with gloves on, the box containing $50 million in cash was tilted in the corner. Angela put the detector on the bottom of the box. The theoretical weight is 78 kilograms, but the actual weight is 3 kilograms less. Someone has moved the interlayer. I pulled out my folding knife and cut open the lining. I almost lost my balance when the yellowed pages floated out. The name listed on the autopsy report was Henry Van Horn Sr., and the date of death was May 17th, 1993, the night of the diamond robbery. Cause of death. Angela leaned in to take a closer look. Acute heart failure. My hands were shaking as I held the report. But the remarks column says, hypodermic injection needle hole. Old Van Horn has a serious heart disease and cannot be injected with adrenaline at all. When the door of the conference room was pushed open, Roy's face was redder than the alarm light. Mock negotiation now. The one-way glass in the negotiation room reflected my blue face. Roy slammed the script on the table. "Respond as I say. Don't engage in your personal reasoning." I didn't read the script. I just lowered my head and flipped through the puzzle book. The system automatically marked 3 time points. 203. Lucas was adopted at the age of 15. 2008. Claire began designing diamond jewelry. And 1993. The robbery occurred. Wait. I looked up suddenly. Lucas is 35 years old now. He was adopted in 2003 when he was 15 years old. In 1993, he was only 3 years old. Roy frowned. What does this have to do with the case? The main suspect in the 1993 robbery had a 3-year-old son. I flipped through the old case files. The media reported at the time that the main suspect's wife was waiting at the alley entrance, with the child in her arms. Angela suddenly knocked on the corner of the table. Claire joined Van Horn Jewelry in 2008, which was the year when old Van Horn's safe design drawings disappeared. The red circle of the puzzle book began to flash wildly. I finally saw the hidden thread. Lucas was the orphan of the main culprit of the robbery. Claire stole the safe password. Edward transferred assets, and everything revolved around. They don't want money. I stood up suddenly. They want liquidation. Roy slammed the table. Now it's a negotiation simulation. I ignored him, grabbed my coat and rushed out. The rain had stopped, and the neon lights of the warehouse shattered into pieces in the puddles. The sound of the hidden door's hinges was particularly clear in the silence. I moved in through the crack in the door, and the smell of rust suddenly rushed into my nose. There is light inside. The man on the stretcher was wearing the dark grey suit that Edward often wore, and the diamond cufflinks on his chest were shining with a cold light. His hands dropped to his sides, the insulin pump on his wrist reading 40 units. A lethal dose. You shouldn't have come. I froze in place. Lucas's voice floated out from the shadows. The gun in his hand pointed at Edward's temple.
It's been 20 years. He took a step forward, the diamond totem on his cuff glowing dark red under the light. It's time to let old Van Horn's secret come to light.
I reached into the puzzle book in my pocket and saw the last red circle was closing. In the shadows deep in the warehouse, Edward's fingers moved as if he wanted to grab something. The smell of rust in the air became stronger. I took a half step forward, my ears aching from the thumping of my heart. The smell of rust in the air became stronger. I took a half step forward, my ears aching from the thumping of my heart. Edward's Adam's apple moved on the stretcher, and his breathing was as light as a broken bellows. His right hand hung at his side, and his index finger was tapping the edge of the stretcher again and again. Short, short, long, short. I stared at the rhythm, and felt a chill on the back of my neck. Morse code, which I heard my father decipher hundreds of times in the evidence room when I was a child. Short, short, long, short, I chanted silently. Teeth, don't move. The moment the metal clashed, all the blood in my body froze. Lucas stepped out of the shadows. The muzzle of his gun pointed directly between my eyes. He was still wearing the same well-tailored dark grey suit, and the diamond pattern on the cuffs glowed dark red under the dim light, like drops of solidified blood. Detective Jane. His voice was so light that it seemed like he was talking about the weather. You are faster than I thought. I stared at his finger on the trigger. The hands that had arranged Lady Claire's necklace at the charity gala the previous week were now white at the knuckles. You knew I would come. I didn't move, but out of the corner of my eye, I saw Edward's index finger tapping again. This time long, short, long. Of course. Lucas tilted his head. How else can we make Mr. Van Horn's kidnapping scene more realistic? There was a sound of pulleys rubbing against the ground behind me. Mrs. Clare walked in pushing the ransom box, the pearl necklace shining coldly around her neck. She pushed the box toward the secret door, and the bottom of the box scraped across the concrete floor with a scratching sound.
You think you won?
She lowered her head to adjust her gloves, a sneer on her face. This is just the beginning. I caught a glimpse of metal reflections in the crack of the secret door. The sliding rail. This place is not a warehouse for hiding hostages at all. It is a transfer point. His right hand quietly reached for the puzzle book in his pocket. The system's red circle flashed wildly, and 3 key words popped up. Abnormal weight of the ransom box, Edward's finger password, and Lucas's cuff totem. Ransom box. I stared at the black suitcase. Last week, Edward's secretary said the box contained 50 million in cash, but when Claire pushed it, the box barely moved. It was too light. There's no money in it, I blurted out. Claire's fingers paused on the clasp of her glove. Lucas lowered the muzzle of his gun 2 inches. Smart. Edward tapped his index finger twice more. Long, long, short. I translated in my mind. C. O. There was a sudden sound of footsteps outside the warehouse. Peripheral control. Roy shouted, "The FBI Special Forces team has arrived." Lucas's pupils shrank to pinpoints. His gun swung, sweeping past me, past Edward, and finally stopping at the secret door. They are about to rush in. I lowered my voice. "If you kill me now, you won't be able to get away." "I don't want to leave," he said, his voice suddenly breaking. "I want the truth." Edward's fingers were still drumming. The rhythm was faster this time. Short, long, short, long. K. What is he talking about? I stared at Lucas. You've raised him for 20 years. Can you really do that to him? The muzzle of Lucas's gun trembled. He looked at Edward, with eyes like knives. That's the way I've seen the main suspect look at Mr. Van Horn in the old robbery photos in the evidence room. Raising. He smiled. He is raising the son of the enemy who killed his father. The secret door suddenly made a buzzing sound. As the slide started to move, Claire bent down to pull the ransom box. A piece of paper was lifted up from the bottom of the box, and I caught a glimpse of the words autopsy report, exactly the same as the death report of old Van Horn found in the Van Horn mansion before. "Jane," Tony shouted from outside the warehouse. We cracked the cloud disk. Claire was selling designs 10 years ago. Lucas's finger tightened on the trigger. I stared at his shaking wrist and suddenly remembered the timeline in the puzzle book. He was adopted in 2003. The main perpetrator of the robbery died in 1993. And in the 10 years in between, he lived with his mother in the slums of Brooklyn. "What did your mother say before she died?" His gun jerked. "She said, 'Don't be like your father.'" I heard my voice shaking. "Or did she say, 'Avenge your father'?" Lucas's forehead was covered with sweat. His eyes flickered from Edward to the secret door and back to my face. The trigger was 2/3 depressed, and I could even see the reflection of the bullet in the chamber. Bang! There was a knock on the door outside the warehouse. Lucas's fingers loosened. He took 2 steps back and pointed the gun at Edward's temple. "It's time," he said, "for old Van Horn's secret to be exposed." Edward's fingers suddenly stopped. He stared at the totem on Lucas's cuff, and his lips moved. I leaned closer and heard him whisper, "Your mother's necklace." The secret door was fully opened, and cold wind blew in. I saw a silver van parked behind the door, with a dozen black suitcases piled in the van that looked like ransom boxes. Roy's shouting got closer. 3, 2, 1. Lucas gave me one last look. His finger was still on the trigger, but he wasn't pulling hard. "Tell Angela to check the dock surveillance footage from December 7th, 1993, he said. Bang. The warehouse door was knocked open. Strong light poured in, and I squinted my eyes. When I opened them again, Lucas had retreated to the secret door. Claire pushed the ransom box into the car and slammed the door shut. Edward's insulin pump suddenly sounded an alarm. I rushed over to adjust the dosage, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the taillights of the truck flash in the rain and fog, and then disappear into the night. The puzzle book was getting hot in my pocket. System prompt. The clue completion rate. The missing 8% was hidden in the silver van. In Claire's sneer, and in Lucas's last unfinished words. Roy put his hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" I didn't say anything, staring at the insulin pump on Edward's wrist. It showed that it had been adjusted to 40 units, but now the dose had been secretly adjusted back to 20. Who adjusted it? Outside the warehouse, Tony ran over holding a tablet. "Jane, there's a video in the cloud drive on a winter night in 2003. At a corner of a Brooklyn alley, a woman stuffed a boy into a car. The woman wore around her neck." He suddenly stopped. I followed his gaze. Half of a necklace chain was exposed from the inner pocket of Edward's suit. The pendant was a faded blue diamond, exactly the same as the missing token of love from the main criminal's wife in the old robbery file. The rain started to fall again. I took out the puzzle book, and the last red circle was slowly closing. The slide track behind the secret door was still humming, and that silver truck was heading towards New York Harbor. As soon as Roy's hand rested on my shoulder, I pulled away and crouched at Edward's feet. He was curled up on the stretcher, his fingers still twitching slightly. When Lucas pointed the gun at him, his hands had been tapping on the metal frame of the stretcher, like some kind of code. The puzzle book was getting hot in his pocket, and the red circle on the system prompt was right at Edward's abnormal behavior. I grabbed Elliot's stethoscope and placed the metal tip on the stand. "Record this." I pointed to his phone. "Put it in recording mode." Elliot didn't ask any more questions, took out his cell phone and pressed the button. There were soft sounds coming from the metal bracket. Da-da-da. Short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. I counted the beats and my temples began to beat. My father taught me Morse code. I practiced it on old tapes in the evidence room for 3 months. 1993 716. As I read out the number, Elliot's phone had just finished recording the last sound. His eyes widened. 30 years ago during the diamond robbery. Tony. I pulled out my intercom. Check the files on the July 16th, 1993 Van Horn jewelry robbery. Focusing on the password leak records. Sirens blasted outside the warehouse, and FBI members were running towards the secret door. Tony's voice came out of the intercom. Found it. On the night of the robbery, in addition to the murder of old Van Horn, the combination to the safe was copied. He paused suddenly. The copy was signed Claire Van Horn. I looked up. Lucas was already pressed against the wall, the handcuffs clanking. He turned his head to look at me, and sneered. Guess why the old man pretended to kidnap?
He knew Claire was the mole.
Roy's tactical boots rolled over the broken glass, and walked over. Detective Marlowe. Explain. Wait 5 minutes. I interrupted him, and opened the puzzle book. The red circle next to Claire's name suddenly expanded, pointing to the autopsy report at the bottom of the ransom box. I remember the note I caught a glimpse of when I unboxed it. The code is hidden in the Blue Moon necklace. Blue Moon is Claire's jewelry design last year. The imitations are displayed in a display case, and the real ones are locked in the Van Horn family safe. I pulled off the ID from my waist and threw it to Roy. Lend it to you. Don't let them touch Edward. The fingerprint lock of the safe is behind the mural in the entrance hall. I typed in Edward's birthday, and the metal door hummed. The cloud disk encryption program that Tony had cracked before flashed on the tablet. I called up the 3D modeling of the Blue Moon necklace. The arc of the diamond arrangement was wrong, and there was a hidden folder hidden in the cut of the 7th main diamond. The moment the file was opened, cold sweat broke out on my back. 20 pages of PDF. Each page is filled with photos. A man in police uniform shaking hands with a robber at the dock. A woman with pearl earrings stuffing a miniature camera into a safe. And the last page is an ID photo of the current New York City Police Commissioner, with US $2 million in hush money marked in the lower right corner. The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Elliot. Edward adjusted the dosage of the insulin pump himself. I stared at the mirror on the wall of the safe, and saw my pale face reflected in it. Turns out that what he directed and acted out was not a kidnapping, but a conspiracy within a conspiracy. Edward had already calculated that Lucas would seek revenge. Claire would be greedy, and even the police chief would cover up for her. What he wants is to expose all the dirt to the sun. There was a siren's honking from the direction of the warehouse. It must be the ambulance. I closed the tablet and took one last look at the list. The name at the top was circled in red pen. Edward Van Horn. The lights in the interrogation room were on at the end of the corridor. When I pushed open the door, Claire was sitting in the corner, tapping her fingertips on the table. She was wearing a Chanel suit, her hair neatly combed, and she looked up at me and smiled. Detective Marlowe, would you like some coffee? I had them cook Blue Mountain. I didn't respond. The puzzle book got hot in the bag, and the system prompted. 98% of the clues are completed. The remaining 2% is hidden in Claire's Blue Mountain coffee, in her burgundy-painted fingertips, in the fake smile that cracks when she sees the list. There were footsteps in the corridor, and Roy's voice sounded outside the door. Marlowe, the director wants to see you. Claire's smile widened. I touched the tablet in my pocket, turned around and pushed the door open. It's going to rain heavily in New York tonight. When I pushed the door open, Claire was tapping the table with her burgundy-polished fingernails. She was wearing a Chanel suit that was ironed without a single wrinkle, like a porcelain doll in a museum. The Blue Mountain coffee is getting cold. She looked up and smiled, with a firmness in the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Wouldn't Detective Marlowe like to try it? I put the tablet on the table and connected the cables. The projector projected a yellowed paper onto the wall, a note from 20 years ago, with beautiful handwriting on it. 230 Dock Warehouse. Combination lock has been copied. This is the letter you sent to the robbers. I said, pointing at the screen. This is the combination to the Van Horn family's old safe. You wrote it down while designing the jewelry. She stared at the photo for 3 seconds, and suddenly laughed out loud. Detective, you should check how many women in New York write cursive. Her fingernails made a crisp sound on the table. I noticed a pale white indentation on the inside of her ring finger. It was a mark left by wearing a ring for a long time, but she was not wearing a wedding ring today. The door was pushed open. Roy's shadow loomed over him, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. The FBI just received an anonymous letter. I glanced at the contents of the letter, and my back teeth felt sore from biting them. Attached to the letter was a screenshot of a bank statement. The recipient was the current director's personal account, and the note was hush money for the diamond robbery. Who sent it? The postmark says Brooklyn, Roy said in a low voice, and the sender gave a name, Lucas Van Horn. Claire's fingertips paused. The phone vibrated in my trouser pocket. It was a message from Angela. The source of the signal has been located. I clicked on the attachment and saw a red dot marked on the satellite map. The landing pad for the Van Horn family's private helicopter. Edward has not been kidnapped, I said, holding the phone tightly. He has been in the helicopter and is controlling all communications with an encrypted program. Claire stood up suddenly, and the chair made a harsh sound on the ground. She stared at the screen behind me. The smile lines at the corners of her eyes stretched into thin lines. So what? Are you going to arrest me? Or the dying old guy? I didn't respond. The puzzle book was getting hot in my bag, and the system prompt sound was buzzing. The completion rate of the clues jumped to. I turned to the last page. The red circles formed a network. Edward adjusted the insulin pump himself, because he knew that Lucas would investigate the case of that year. He wrote the cloud disk encryption program himself, deliberately leaving loopholes for Tony to crack. The autopsy report at the bottom of the ransom box was the bait he placed on the path that Claire had to take. He had calculated Lucas's revenge, Claire's greed, and even that the director would send someone to intercept the ransom. He was setting up a trap for his own death. He has pancreatic cancer. I heard my own voice. The medical examination report from 3 months ago is hidden at the bottom of the safe. Claire's face turned pale. He's going to disappear. I slammed the puzzle book on the table. Use Lucas to uncover the old case. Use the kidnapping case as a lead to force the police to investigate the robbers, the traitor, and you. She took a half step back and knocked over her coffee cup. The dark brown liquid dripped in lines along the edge of the table, just like the blood in the dock warehouse 20 years ago. He's not a victim. I stared at the cracks in her pupils and said, he's a witness who pledged his life. There were footsteps in the corridor. Roy's shadow passed by the glass again. The director wants to see you. Claire suddenly laughed. She bent down to pick up the coffee cup, her burgundy nail scratching the wall of the cup. Detective Marlowe, why do you think he circled his name at the top of the list?
I didn't answer.
As I grabbed my tablet and walked out, I caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass, her lipstick-coated lips silently saying goodbye. The lights in the interrogation room were still on. I stood at the end of the corridor and watched her pick up the letter that had fallen on the ground. The wind blew in through the window, blowing up a strand of her hair and revealing the light blue veins behind her ear. She suddenly raised her head, and our eyes met through the glass. She smiled. That smile was like a knife, cutting through all the disguises. The puzzle book hurts in my hands. I closed the notebook and heard my own heartbeat drowning out the footsteps in the corridor. Are some truths really worth making public? I was standing outside the interrogation room when Claire, who was on the other side of the glass, suddenly looked up. The corners of her mouth, which was painted with burgundy lipstick, were raised half an inch, and there was a hint of coldness in the fine lines at the end of her eyes. It was not a smile of surrender, but more like a hunter watching his prey run into the net by itself. I took out my phone and sent a message to Tony. Check Claire's communication records for the last 72 hours. focusing on the 2 hours before the kidnapper sent the first tweet. When my palms were numb from the vibration of my phone, I was staring at her wedding ring on her finger with pearl nail polish. Tony's text message popped up. Encrypted number 3 minutes and 17 seconds call. The time matches. The door opened with a click. I walked in with the tablet in my arms and pressed the projection button too hard, causing her to squint her eyes due to the blue light from the screen. "This is your handwriting from 20 years ago." I pointed at the signature in the photo, which overlapped with the handwriting in the code book, left at the scene of the diamond robbery. "When you were copying the code of old Van Horn's safe, you wrote experimental record." She didn't hide. He tapped his nails on the table. "So what? Do you think I'm the only one who did something wrong?" Her eyes swept across the door. Roy was holding a folder and talking to the assistant director, his back like a shadow against the glass. "Your system is worse than you think." She laughed. "It's so bad that it can't even protect its own people." I gripped the tablet tightly. When he went out, he knocked over a plastic chair, and the clang sound startled Roy so much that he turned his head. He nodded at me, the sweat on his forehead shining under the overhead light. Elliot's laboratory smelled of formalin. I slapped Edward's blood sample tube in front of him. "Retest for neurotoxins." He pushed up his glasses. "Didn't you say it was homemade? Take the test again." The instrument hummed for 10 minutes. He suddenly knocked his chair backwards and said, "This is the fucking Blue Star number 2. A test piece that was eliminated from the Municipal Bureau's evidence laboratory 3 years ago. Only internal personnel can get it." I dug my fingers into my palms. The words Blue Moon Project rolled in my throat, but I didn't dare to speak out loud. Roy's office door was closed. I knocked 3 times before he opened his collar. 2 buttons were loose and his tie was crooked on his collarbone. The diamond robbery from 30 years ago was the codename Blue Moon. I stared at the new pimple behind his ear. It wasn't there yesterday. His pupils shrank to pinpoints. His Adam's apple moved, and his voice sounded like sandpaper grinding glass. "If you really want to know, go ask your boss." When I turned around, he suddenly grabbed my wrist. The force was painful. "Don't dig too deep, Jane. There are some things. Let go." I pulled my hand back, and my sleeve rubbed against his badge. Half of the police number was scratched off by my fingernails. The walk back to the office was slow. The puzzle book got hot in my bag, and the system prompt sounded like a small hammer hitting my temple. I turned to the last page, and red letters danced on the screen. "Claire holds the blacklist." Blacklist. I stared at these 3 words, and my back teeth felt sore from biting them. She is not the target of the investigation, but the one who set up the trap. Outside the window, police sirens cut through the night. I closed the puzzle book and stroked the cover with my fingertips. It was a gift from my father, wrapped in brown paper with his profile notes from that year. The phone vibrated in his trouser pocket. It was an anonymous message with only 6 words. "Don't trust Roy." I looked up the hallway. The light in Roy's office was still on, and a figure moved in the shadows. It looked like the assistant director holding a black briefcase. The wind blew up the files on the table. Edward's medical examination report floated to his feet, and the words "advanced pancreatic cancer" made his eyes hurt. Are some truths really worth being made public? The phone vibrated again. I looked down and saw the second anonymous text message. In the lower left drawer of his office. "There's what you want." I held the phone tightly, my nails leaving a crescent mark on the metal shell. The emergency exit light at the end of the corridor was blindingly red, like a pair of eyes. The phone vibrated so hard in my palm that it felt numb. When the second anonymous text message popped up, I was staring at the half-open door of Roy's office. The assistant director had just come out with a black box, and his cuffs were stained with blue ink, like drops of solidified blood. "Don't believe Roy." The first text was still staring at me on the screen. I rushed into the stairwell, phone in hand, with my back against the cold brick wall. 3 days ago in Elliot's laboratory, His knuckles turned white when he grabbed my wrist. Yesterday, when I asked about the Blue Moon project, his Adam's apple trembled like a bird with its neck stepped on. This morning, half of the number on his badge was missing again. This bastard, what is he hiding? From that day on, I started to keep time. At 9:58 on the first day, he touched the back of his neck and pushed the mug to the intern. At 10 o'clock sharp, he stood up and said, "I'm taking a call from headquarters," and swiped the door card to open the security passage. The next day at 2 minutes to 10, he suddenly said, "I'm going to the bathroom," but the elevator surveillance showed that he didn't go into the bathroom at all. At 10:03, on the third day, I stood behind the glass curtain wall of the command center and watched him put his suit over the back of a chair. His movements were half a beat slower than the previous 2 days. He finally missed it. "Tony, help me hack into his cell phone." I typed Roy's cell phone number on the technical keyboard. He pushed up his blue light blocking glasses and tapped quickly on the keyboard. "How long will the investigation take?" 3 days. "It costs extra money." He looked up and smiled at me, his eyes shining like a cat that had stolen a fish. 2 hours later, Tony slammed the tablet on my desk. The 3 red dots on the map are connected into a line, all falling on 7th Avenue in Brooklyn, the Sacred Heart Clinic. I dug up the old case files and found that the doctor who wrote the autopsy report on the diamond robbery 3 years ago was Tom Hawke, a registered physician at the Sacred Heart Clinic. The old man retired last year, but the clinic license is still under his name. "Jane." Angela rushed in with a folder in her arms, her blonde hair stained with printer toner. She pushed a screenshot of an encrypted email in front of me. "Received at headquarters this morning." The sender used Roy's digital signature. The title of the email hurt my eyes. "Internal report on the Blue Moon project." He reported himself. My throat tightened. Angela shook her head. The IP address jumped through 5 layers of proxies. "But there is a recording in the attachment." She pressed the play button, and Roy's voice was mixed in the sound of electricity. Harold knew that Van Horn's pancreatic cancer report was forged. Claire's blacklist. I suddenly pressed the pause button, and cold sweat broke out on my back. This bastard, is he a double agent? At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Roy was called to a meeting by the director. I grabbed the evidence department keychain and headed straight for his locker. The moment the metal cabinet door opened with a click, a black notebook slid out. Turning to the latest page, the handwriting was as scribbled as if it was carved with a knife. Harold Black, September 15th, 1900 Central Station B12 Locker Clearance Operation A. Turning further back, Van Horn transfers assets September 20th. Lucas cooperates and needs to control insulin dosage. My fingers were shaking. They knew this was a self-directed kidnapping. "Found it?" A female voice suddenly sounded behind him. I turned around and saw Lena Carson standing at the door, holding a coffee cup, water dripping from the ends of her hair. She had obviously just come out of the bathroom. She didn't look at the notebook in my hand, but took out the ID from her pocket. "FBI Internal Investigation Team. We have been following Roy for 3 months." The cover of the ID glowed coldly. "He and Harold are covering up the old case of the Blue Moon project. Your father was also investigating this." I clenched the notebook tightly, digging my nails into my palms. "Why now?" She took a sip of coffee, which was too cold. She frowned. "The day you found out about the Sacred Heart Clinic, we knew you wouldn't stop." Police sirens whistled outside the window, and her voice was as light as a sigh. "Be careful, they're going to silence us." It was windy on the rooftop, so I stuffed my notebook into the inner pocket of my windbreaker. The lights of Manhattan spread out under my feet like a handful of diamonds. The puzzle book was getting hot in my bag, so I turned to Roy's page. The system prompt sounded ding, and a red circle suddenly popped up next to his name. When I clicked it, it was a recording. In the sound of electricity, Roy's voice mixed with the sound of wind. "The next target is you." My cell phone vibrated at this moment. It was a message from the night watchman at the warehouse. Mr. Van Horn is still unconscious, and his temperature is normal. I looked down at the watch. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and it was time for the night watchman at the warehouse to change shifts. The wind lifted the hem of my windbreaker, and I touched the pepper spray in my pocket. This time, I wanted to go and see it for myself. I wrapped my windbreaker tightly around me, and the wind at 2 o'clock in the morning felt like icicles drilling into my collar. The iron door of the warehouse was badly rusted and made a harsh squeak when pushed. The old man on night watch was dozing off against the wall. All jazz music was playing on the radio, and the thermos at his feet was still steaming. It looked like he had just made coffee. Edward lay on the camp bed, breathing as heavily as a bellows. I crouched down and swept the beam of my flashlight across his face. His eyelids moved and his Adam's apple rolled, but he didn't open his eyes. Mr. Van Horn. I reached out and pressed his wrist. His pulse was beating twice as fast as that of a comatose patient. You're pretending too well. His eyelashes fluttered. I took out my puzzle book and turned to the insulin page, with a red circle saying, dosage error. Your personal doctor said that 0.5 ml is the critical value. You asked your adopted son to adjust it to 0.4 ml, which would not cause immediate death and keep the blood sugar in a semi-comatose state. I leaned closer. Now tell me, is this a kidnapping case or a testimony performance? His right little finger suddenly moved. My pupils contracted. Morse code my father taught me. The first one is short, the second one is long, the third one is short. Next are ENS. You staged this incident yourself, so that the kidnappers would ask for an open investigation. I slapped the puzzle book on his chest. This way, you could speak the truth of 30 years ago in public as a victim, but you didn't expect that someone would change the ransom demand in advance and increase the insulin dosage to zero. His little finger moved again. This time it was 3 short dots. Save me. When I straightened up, cold sweat suddenly broke out on the back of my neck. There were footsteps on the second floor of the warehouse. Very light, like a cat's claws scratching the floor. Lucas stepped out of the shadows carrying a silver medicine box. He was wearing a dark gray turtleneck sweater with a half pattern showing at the cuffs. Exactly the same robber's crest I'd seen in the evidence room. Detective Jane. He smiled and put the medical kit next to Edward's head. You came just in time. I was just about to give him a life-saving injection. Your father was the main culprit in the robbery. I stared at his cuffs. You approached Edward for revenge. He opened the medicine box, and the sound of metal instruments colliding was particularly clear in the empty warehouse. When I was 15, I was rummaging through trash cans in the slums of Brooklyn. He stopped in front of me in a stretched Lincoln and said, "You look like my son who died young." He looked up, his eyes cold. Later I found a photo in his study. My father was pinned to the ground by his father's bodyguard, and his head smashed on a diamond display case. So you cooperated with him in the kidnapping scene. He needed a kidnapper to make an old claim, and I needed a victim identity to cover up the revenge. He pulled out the syringe, until Mrs. Clare taped the autopsy report to the bottom of the ransom box. She hates him more than I do. My phone vibrates. It's the location Lena sent me. FBI archives room. Bring a gun. The iron door of the archive room is thicker than that of the vault. Lena, wearing white gloves, pulled out a brown paper bag from the safe. The seal was stamped with a red seal that read Blue Moon Project, Top Secret. 30 years ago, Edward's father was the head of the CIA's Special Operations Group, Blue Moon. She flipped open the file and saw a photo of a man in a 3-piece suit who looked 70%. They robbed their competitors' collections in the name of cracking down on black market diamonds and then laundered the proceeds through Van Horn jewelry. I pointed at the man being pinned down in the photo. Is this Lucas's father? He found the account book of the Blue Moon Project. Lena tapped the copy of the autopsy report with her nails. The cause of death was written as accidental fall from the building, But in fact, Edward was pushed down by his father's bodyguard. She closed the file. Your father found out about Blue Moon, so they forged his retirement report. Until now, Harold is still cleaning up the insiders. I fished out my phone and found Harold's number. Before pressing the dial button, I spread the puzzle book on the table. All the red circles were connected into a network. Edward's asset transfer, Lucas's totem, Claire's autopsy report, Roy's notebook. The last red circle was my own name, marked witness. Jane, Harold's voice came from the receiver, hoarse from just waking up. You're calling so late, what did you find out? I need your help to keep it secret. I lowered my voice. Edward has woken up. He said he wants to make the Blue Moon project public. There was silence on the other end of the line for 5 seconds. Where are you now? FBI archives. I stared at Lena, and she gestured to me to go ahead. But I can help you deal with him. As long as... Only what? Tell me, is the Blue Moon project still running?
He chuckled. Jane, do you think all diamond transactions in Manhattan are legal? Half of the city's wealth chain is tied to Blue Moon's account book. His voice suddenly turned cold. So Edward must die, Lucas must die, and you... I pressed the speakerphone button and turned the phone toward Lena. She nodded into the air and raised the recorder. I understand. I interrupted him. See you at the warehouse tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. After hanging up the phone, Lena put the file into the evidence bag. Harold's people will be here in half an hour. The detonator key you want is in the newsroom. I stood in front of the puzzle book and watched all the clues finally spell out 2 words, truth. At 4 o'clock in the morning, I was standing downstairs of the news building. My shadow was reflected in the glass curtain wall. In the pocket of my windbreaker was a recorder, a copy of the file, and "Save Me" written by Edward in Morse code. When the receptionist looked up, I tugged at my collar, looking for editor Margaret. She paused on the phone for 2 seconds and pressed the extension number. Miss Margaret, there is a Miss Jane who wants to see you. I stared at her finger, pressing the call button, and heard a vague "let her wait" from the other end of the phone. The puzzle book was getting hot in my bag, and the last page slowly emerged, witness. When the receptionist looked up, I gave her name, Margaret. Her fingertips paused on the phone for 2 seconds and dialed the extension number. Miss Margaret, a Miss Jane is looking for you. Her voice was weak and her eyes glanced at the pocket of my windbreaker, where the hard cover of the puzzle book was bulging. 5 minutes later, Margaret opened the door. She had dark circles under her eyes, as if she had been punched. She was wearing a wrinkled suit and was holding half a cold croissant in her hand. When she was in college, she always said, "An investigative journalist's dignity lies on the keyboard." Now it seems that threatening letters can destroy a person's dignity more than deadlines. Without saying a word, she dragged me into the small meeting room next to the stairwell. The moment the door was locked, she took out instant coffee from the drawer. 3 days ago, someone stuffed a bullet into my daughter's school mailbox. Her hands were shaking as she tore the package. The anonymous letter said that if it happened again with the Van Horn case, the next bullet would penetrate her cerebellum. I spread the puzzle book on the table and turned to the page with the photocopies, comparing Claire's signature, the handwriting on the kidnapping scene note she forged, and the note she took to copy the safe combination for the robbers 20 years ago. The hooks of each R overlapped. The Morse code that Edward engraved on the insulin pen. I used the deciphering method my father taught me to decipher it, and it turned out to be the Blue Moon account book is at the secret door of the warehouse. At the bottom was a high-definition photo of Lucas's cuff totem and a scan of the robber's coat of arms in the robbery file from 30 years ago. 2 rhombus diamonds. Even the position of the notch was exactly the same. Margaret dug her nails into the edge of the copy. This is enough to blow up half of Wall Street. She took out the recorder and said, "Let's start." There was a sudden commotion in the corridor. Lena's figure flashed in, holding a half-disassembled telephone extension in her hand. She threw the extension onto the table, A hair-thin copper wire was wrapped around the circuit board. Someone has hacked the system here. She pulled out my SIM card and put it in an anti-tracking bag. They're locating your signal.
How long? I asked. There was an abnormal data flow 5 minutes ago. She fished out an encrypted USB drive from her pocket and plugged it into the conference room phone. The conversation content is now being uploaded to the FBI cloud. A green progress bar popped up on the screen. Harold's people will be here in 10 minutes. My phone vibrated at this moment. Harold's number popped up and I pressed speakerphone. Jane, when your father was investigating Blue Moon, 3 of his old friends followed him to follow the clues. His voice was like ice water. One of them is now in a nursing home. One teaches history in high school. And the other, pause for 2 seconds, just had a heart bypass surgery. Margaret's mouse hovered over the publish button, and the screen was blindingly bright. The title has been drafted. Blue Moon under Manhattan's gold chain. The hidden thread between the bloody murder 30 years ago and today's kidnapping. You want me to be the executioner? I clenched the puzzle book tightly, and the red circle hurt between my fingers.
I want you to be smart, he chuckled. Edward will not survive the night. Lucas's gun is loaded. As for you,
that's enough. I hung up the phone and looked up to meet Margaret's eyes. My reflection was reflected in her pupils, like a piece of broken glass. Send it. She pressed her fingers on the keyboard. Wait. I held the back of her hand. She pulled her hand back abruptly. You know this is the only chance. We need Edward's testimony. I turned to the last page of the puzzle book. He carved, "Save me" on the insulin pen. It wasn't for the kidnappers. It was for me. Margaret stared at me and suddenly laughed. He's in the ICU. The doctor said he won't last more than 2 hours. I fished out the note Edward had written in Morse code, the corners of which were wrinkled with sweat. The puzzle book was getting hot in the bag, and the 3 words "witness" on the last page were oozing blood. When I walked out of the news building, the wind blew snow particles onto my face. The phone vibrated, and a text message came from an unknown number. Don't forget you are a police officer, not a judge. I held the phone tightly, turned around and walked towards the hospital. The ceiling light of the ICU flickered on and off at the corner of the street. Like some unfinished signal, I looked at Edward through the glass of the ICU. His face was as white as a sheet, with a breathing tube inserted into his throat, and his chest rose and fell with the hum of the instrument. The green line on the heart rate monitor was moving steadily, just as Elliot had said half an hour ago. The neurotoxins had been cleared, and it was time to wake up. He's pretending. Elliot's white coat brushed against my shoulder. Last Wednesday, when I was doing a toxicology analysis on him, he squeezed my wrist hard enough to break a pen. Now, he tapped on the glass. Not even an eyelid fluttered. I turned to look at him. Self-consciousness suppression. Smart. Elliot took out a mint and put it in his mouth. It's like someone covering his ears and insisting he didn't hear the gunshot. He doesn't want to wake up. I held the puzzle book tightly, and the red circle left a mark on the cover. The sound of Dr. Isabel's high heels came from the corridor. She held the tablet in her hand, her knuckles turning white. Medication records. I need your signature. From last Wednesday to the day of the kidnapping. I took the tablet away and swiped quickly. Blood sugar monitoring, blood pressure medication, insulin stop at the last line, memory inhibitor, dose 0.5 milligram, injected for 3 consecutive days. This medicine treats post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Isabel suddenly spoke, her voice tense. He said he's been having nightmares lately. About the Blue Moon heist. I looked up. Her pupils suddenly contracted, and when she turned around, the hem of her white coat swept across the green ivy on the windowsill. Lena's hand was on my lower back, burning hot. I have cracked 70% of the encrypted video in the cloud disk. She lowered her voice. I need a password. It may be related to his personal belongings. I fished out the pocket watch from Edward's suit pocket. The brass case was polished to a shine and made a click sound when it opened. The photo showed a man in a suit holding little Edward in overalls in his arms. A line of small words is engraved on the back. June 12, 1987. My father's last gift. The anniversary of his father's death. Lena leaned over to take a look. Try this. As the video loaded, the monitor suddenly sounded a short alarm. I looked back and saw Edward's fingers moving, his nails leaving shallow marks on the sheets. The screen lights up. Edward sat in the study, with a wall of jewelry designs behind him. He wasn't wearing his glasses, and the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes were deeper than usual. If you see this, it means I lose. On June 12, 1987, my father planned the Blue Moon robbery. His voice was like a rusty gear. The target was not diamonds, but 3 boxes of dirty money. He bribed the security guards and put the blame on his competitors. The clean money later became the first pot of gold for the Van Horn group. Claire knows. He tugged at his bow tie. 20 years ago, she helped the robbers copy the safe combination. When I found her, she was kneeling in front of the jewelry cabinet, crying, saying that she wanted pure design inspiration. Lucas? He suddenly laughed. He is the son of the main criminal. When I found him in the slums of Brooklyn, he was squatting in the alley and cutting his wrist with a piece of glass. Exactly the same action as his father before he was shot dead. I was the one who initiated this kidnapping. He tapped the table with his fingers. The transfer of assets was a smokescreen, and changing the ransom to ask for the truth was to lure the snake out of its hole. I adjusted the dosage of the insulin pen, not to be fatal, but to make him act quickly. But I didn't expect his Adam's apple rolled. Lucas's gun was loaded with real bullets. Claire's ransom box has a secret door leading to the dock, and my father's autopsy report is stuck to the bottom of the box. She wants all the secrets to sink into the Hudson River. The video suddenly freezes. Edward's face flickered in the snowflakes. When he reappeared, he looked straight at the camera. Jane, when your father was investigating Blue Moon, did he ever say to you in the evidence room, when he was playing jigsaw puzzles with you that night, a good police officer is not a judge, but a witness? The alarms from the monitors sounded one after another. My head snapped back, and Edward's eyes opened. He stared at me. The video projection on the wall reflected in his pupils, and his lips moved. I could read his lip movements. Be my witness. I retreated to the hallway as Isabel rushed in with the ambulance. Lena stuffed the tablet into my arms, and the screen stopped at the last frame of the video. Edward's hand was pressing on the Blue Moon diamond design, and half of the photo leaked out from between his fingers. It was the autopsy report of June, and the cause of death column read, gunshot wound, shot at close range. The phone vibrated in my pocket. Text message from unknown number. FBI room 307. 3 files awaiting you. I turned around holding the tablet. The elevator door opened, and people in black suits filed out. Harold's men had arrived. The sound of their leather shoes hitting the ground was like some kind of countdown. 3 days later, I was standing in the file room at FBI headquarters, holding 3 documents with their corners curled up. The first one was the closing report of the Blue Moon robbery in 1987. The second one was the bank statement of Edward's father. And the third one, the name on the cover made my fingertips tremble. Jane Marlowe, retired FBI profiler and member of the investigation team of the 1987 Blue Moon robbery. Chapter 12. The price list of witnesses. I pinched the corners of the 3 documents and stroked the curled pages with my fingertips. The cold air from the FBI archives room penetrated the back of my neck. The first copy was a copy of Edward's testimony video. The image of him saying "be my witness" on his hospital bed was still flashing in my mind. The second was Claire's blacklist, which included jewelers, bank managers, and even the tailor who made a dress for her charity dinner. The amounts were marked after their names. What she exchanged for her design inspiration was never art. The third document is the thickest. It is the record of Harold and Roy's secret meeting. The timeline starts from the night when the Blue Moon robbery was closed. Every page is stamped with a red confidential seal. Have you thought about it? Lena's voice came from behind. She was leaning against the filing shelf, with a little coffee stain on the cuffs of her suit. Exactly the same as when she pushed the tablet to me in the hospital corridor 3 days ago. I shook my head. The light coming through the glass window cut the shadow of the document into pieces. Harold's name danced on the page. The sound of his leather shoes tapping on the ground when he led his men into the hospital 3 days ago overlapped with the silence of the archive room at this moment. Once these things are made public, Harold's badge will be destroyed, Roy's identity will be exposed, Claire's charity gala will become a trial, and I will become a time bomb in their eyes. The phone vibrated in my pocket. Margaret's message popped up. The draft of the front page is in your mailbox, and you need to confirm the official statement. I stared at the screen and smiled. Where is the official statement? Edward's insulin pen, Lucas's gun, Claire's secret door. The truth pieced together from these fragments is itself the sharpest bullet. Simple. I turned around and saw Roy standing in the doorway to the archives room. He was not wearing that neat suit, and his grey t-shirt was wrinkled and tucked into his jeans, looking like an ordinary person who had just bought a sandwich from a convenience store. He held a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, his knuckles turning white. I'm not a good person, but I'm not the bad person you think I am. There are some things you have to see for yourself. The coordinates on the note pointed to the old industrial area of Brooklyn, and I took the subway for half an hour holding the note. The iron door of the abandoned archive was hung with a rusty lock. I pried it open with a Swiss Army knife. I borrowed from the police station. The smell of mold and dust hit me in the face. The innermost corner was covered with a piece of torn canvas. When it was opened, there was a metal box. The lock was rusted and fell off when it was pulled. The contents of the box made my heart skip a beat. The first was a diamond ring with vine patterns carved into the setting, and dark brown blood stains on the inside of the diamond. Exactly the same pattern as the one on Lucas's cuff. The second item was a stack of photos, which were photos of the crime scene in 1987. Edward's father was lying in front of the safe, and the blood on his chest dyed the Blue Moon diamond red. At the bottom was a letter. The handwriting on the envelope made my hands tremble. It was my father's handwriting. Jane, if you see this letter, it means that a corner of the truth about Blue Moon has been revealed. His handwriting was still so sloppy. Back then, I found out that Claire was involved in copying the code, that the main culprit had a newborn son, and that Harold received hush money from the robbers, but I didn't say it, not because I was afraid, but because the letter rustled in my hands, and the last sentence was blurred by ink. Some truths, if told, will kill more people. I stuffed the letter into the inner pocket of my coat and the tin box closed with a clang. The sunlight shone in through the broken window, shining on the bloody ring. The light reflected by the diamond facets was so bright that it was blinding. It turns out that Lucas's action of cutting his wrists was to imitate the despair before his father was shot. It turns out that Edward adjusted the insulin dosage, not to lure the snake out of its hole, but to use his own life as the last piece of the puzzle. It was already dark when we returned to the police station. I took out the puzzle book I always carried with me, the cover of which was worn to a shine. This was a gift from my father when he retired. He said, "Every contradiction is a piece of the puzzle. When it is complete, the truth is hidden in the gap." The last page is empty. I took out my pen, with the tip of the pen hovering over the paper, and suddenly remembered what Edward said in the video. A good policeman's job is not to judge, but to bear witness. The ink fell, and the name written was Jane Marlowe. It turns out that witnesses are never people who stand outside and record. It's about putting yourself in the puzzle, letting the edges of all the pieces pierce into your flesh, and then standing out and saying, "Look, this is the truth." The phone vibrated on the table. Margaret had 7 missed calls. I called back, and as soon as she said hello, I said, publish it all. After hanging up the phone, I walked to the window. The night spread in, and the lights of Manhattan were like a handful of broken diamonds. Claire's secret door, Harold's secrets, and Roy's note all faded into shadows in the light. Tomorrow there will be reporters blocking the door of the police station. There will be a hearing, and someone will bang the table and call me crazy. But so what? I touched the letter in my inner pocket, turned and left the office. My father's old study is in Queens, and I haven't been there for a long time. His old coffee cup should still be on the desk. The green ivy on the windowsill has probably withered, and that yellowed letter should still be lying in the deepest part of the drawer, waiting for me to read the remaining half of the sentence. The night was getting darker and I was walking home, the puzzle book in my pocket digging into my thigh. Tomorrow will be different, but at least the truth won't sink into the Hudson River again. I sat in my father's old study with the yellowed letter spread out on my knees. The edges of the letter were curled and frayed, and half of the evidence bag number sticker was stuck to the back. 201-07-12, the filing date of the Blue Moon robbery. If you see this letter, it means I no longer have the courage to face it. His handwriting was still so sloppy, and the ink from the pen spread over the word courage like tears that had not been wiped away. I turned the letter over and over again. The number on the evidence bag was handwritten by my father, and the ink was darker than that on the letter. At that time he was still an FBI agent, running around the bureau every day carrying an evidence box. I suddenly remembered that when I was 10 years old, he squatted in the evidence room and taught me how to recognize fingerprint cards. He said, every case is a puzzle, and if one piece is missing, the truth cannot be revealed. I didn't look up when the door opened. Lena's heels tapped on the wooden floor, making a very light tapping sound, different from the sound she usually made when she stepped on the marble floor in the bureau. Jane. She placed a stack of files next to me, with Blue Moon Project Top Secret printed on the cover. I glimpsed my father's signature in the lower right corner of the folder. Dated December 3rd, 2001, 3 months after the Blue Moon robbery. Your father was a member of the task force. She sat in the leather swivel chair her father often sat in, her fingers unconsciously stroking the edge of the file bag. But his name is not in the case report. He withdrew from the investigation and destroyed the communication records between the robber and Claire. I tightened my grip around the letter. For the past 20 years, every time I asked about the Blue Moon robbery, my father would either pour tea or look out the window, and finally he would say, for some cases it is better to keep a breath than to investigate it thoroughly. Now I understand that he was not avoiding the thing. He was avoiding himself. The phone vibrates on the wooden table. Margaret's message popped up. Space reserved for the front page headline. Requires official confirmation. I stared at the screen and remembered what she said in the cafe yesterday. Your father's testimony will shake the entire system. Official confirmation? I laughed into the phone, took a photo of the letter, and sent it over. This is the only official thing I can give you. She immediately responded with a handshake emoji, followed by the following line. Thank you, Jane. You are braver than you think. Are you brave? I looked down at the puzzle book on the table. The cover was polished to a shine. This was given to me by my father when he retired. He said, every contradiction is a puzzle piece. Don't jump to conclusions if they are not complete. Now the last page read Jane Marlowe. The ink had dried and looked like a scar. The landline suddenly rang. The number is from the bureau, so you know who it is without answering the phone. Harold's voice seeped out of the receiver, 10 times gentler than usual. Your father is a smart man. He knows that once some truths are made public, it's like opening Pandora's box, which can't be taken back. I didn't say anything and gently put the phone back on the landline. The wind from outside the window blew in, making the letters rustle. The last words in my father's letter suddenly appeared in front of me. It's not because of fear, but it's because he wants to protect something, Lena said suddenly. She opened the Blue Moon Project file, and a photo fell out. Claire 20 years ago wearing a Chanel suit, standing in front of Edward's father's safe, holding a note in her hand. I picked up the photo. The numbers on the note were the combination to the safe, in Claire's handwriting. Your father found out that Claire copied the password, that the robber had a newborn son, and that Harold had received the money. Lena pointed to the annotation on the back of the photo, which was her father's handwriting. But he didn't hand it in because the robber's son was in the hospital incubator at the time, because Claire was only 3 months pregnant, and because Harold's wife was the forensic doctor in the bureau. That's enough, I interrupted her. My throat felt tight, as if I had swallowed a piece of ice. My father was not a coward. He just used silence to leave a way out for those innocent people. But now Lucas cut his wrists to imitate his father's death, and Edward adjusted the insulin dosage to be the last piece of the puzzle. They were all risking their lives to find the truth. I closed the puzzle book. The crease on the cover rubbed against my palm just like the force with which my father patted my shoulder in the past. Let's go. I stood up and stuffed the letter into my coat pocket. There's one last witness to meet. Lena followed me out. In the darkness of night, her car was parked under an old elm tree. The headlights cast the shadow of the tree on the ground like a spread-out fingerprint. When I sat in the passenger seat, my phone vibrated. Text message from an unknown number. Don't forget your dad was also involved in what happened that night. I stared at the screen, my back hair tingling. That night? The night of the Blue Moon robbery. My father didn't mention this in his letter. Lena started the car, the light from the dashboard shining on her face.
Where are we going?
St. Mary's Hospital. I remembered that when Edward was rescued, the doctor said he might not survive the night. There are some things that need to be asked clearly before he dies. The car drove onto the Queensboro Bridge, and the lights of Manhattan flowed outside the car window. I touched the letter in my inner pocket and looked at the message from Margaret on my phone. Her report will be published tomorrow, with the title, Blue Moon Robbery, The Silent Truth and the Blood of Two Generations. Harold is right. The system will be shaken when the truth comes out. But I don't intend to inherit the peace that my father gained through his lifetime of silence. As we turned into the hospital parking lot, I received Margaret's final message. The layout is ready. Claire's name is on the front page. I smiled at the screen. Tomorrow, many people will have trouble sleeping. What I have to do is to walk into the interrogation room, look at the woman in the Chanel suit, and piece together the secret she has hidden for 20 years into the sunlight, piece by piece. When I pushed open the door to the interrogation room, Claire was stirring tea in a bone china cup with a silver spoon. The tea was jasmine-scented, and the aroma mixed with the jingle of the Cartier bracelet on her wrist. Sit down. She raised her eyes, and her pearl earrings swayed. Didn't your father tell you? Some secrets can only be kept by the dead. I slammed my father's letter on the table. The heat from her teacup left light yellow stains on the craft paper cover. As she lowered her head to read the letter, her eyelashes fluttered. They were the false eyelashes she had worn at the charity gala last week, with half a diamond stuck to the glue marks. What do you want? I asked straight to the point. She pushed the letter back. Her nails painted the same burgundy color as her Chanel suit. I can give you a list of murderers from 30 years ago, account books, and evidence of crimes committed by police and politicians. Her fingertips tapped her father's signature on the letter. But you have to promise me to let Edward go. I frowned. 3 days ago in the warehouse, as she pushed the ransom box toward the secret door, Edward was lying on the ground twitching, with the insulin pen rolling beside him. He is your husband. I expressed the doubts in my heart. He's my daughter's father. She suddenly laughed. Why do you think Lucas keeps staring at the diamond pattern I drew? His mother died of childbirth in Brooklyn, and my daughter lived for 3 more days in the incubator. just to wait for Edward to sign the overseas asset transfer agreement. The door was pushed open. Lucas was handcuffed, and a diamond totem on his cuff scraped against the door frame, leaving a shallow white scratch. He stared at Claire, his Adam's apple moving. "Did you tell him? Or do you plan to continue using my daughter as a bargaining chip?" My back felt tight. 3 days ago in the warehouse, when Lucas pointed his gun, he shouted, "Mom," but it turned out that she was not Claire. "You should thank me." Claire picked up the teacup. "If I hadn't changed your mother's blood bag, you would be in a cemetery in the Bronx now, instead of sitting here acting with me." Lucas suddenly yanked at the handcuffs. Amid the sound of metallic collision, I could clearly see the pattern of his totem. It was exactly the same as the robber's emblem in the Blue Moon robbery file, except for the addition of a tiny daisy. The phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Lena. $5 million has been deposited into Claire's offshore account from the Eclipse Trust. I looked up at Claire, who was poking a lemon slice with a silver spoon, and the juice splashed onto the letter paper, smearing my father's handwriting. "Who's afraid of exposure?" I asked. She mashed the lemon slices into a paste. "Do you think the man who got the FBI to suppress the robbery file will let Margaret's story appear in the newspaper now?" My frown was reflected on the glass of the interrogation room. Claire suddenly looked up and smiled at me. The same smile she had given me 3 days earlier when she handed me the macarons in the Van Horn's living room. "Make a choice, Jane." Her voice was like a knife dipped in honey. "Exchange your father's silence for the truth, or exchange Edward's life for the silence of more people." I pulled out my puzzle book. The red circle next to the word Claire on the cover suddenly cracked, and 2 options popped up: trade, liquidation. There were footsteps at the end of the corridor. Lena came over holding her phone. "Edward won't last more than 2 hours. The doctor asked the family to be prepared." I looked at Lucas behind the glass. He was staring at the daisies on his cuffs, his handcuffs clinking on his knees. "To the hospital." I closed the puzzle book. "Take Lucas with you." When he stood up, the handcuffs hit the corner of the table, making a crisp sound. The moonlight came in through the window, shining on his pale face, like it was shining on a piece of cold iron. The handcuffs clicked against Lucas's wrists as I loaded him into the police car. He lowered his eyes to look at the tip of his shoe. The heel was stained with the blue paint of the interrogation room, like a solidified bruise. "I'm not here to atone for my sins," he said suddenly, his voice like sandpaper scraping against glass. "I'm here to complete my mission." I gripped the steering wheel tightly. His pupils shrank to pinpoints in the rearview mirror. "What mission?" "You'll find out soon enough." The smell of disinfectant in the hospital corridor makes people's noses sore. Lena was leaning against the nurse's station, scrolling through her phone. When she saw us coming, she shook the screen at me. Elliot's message popped up. Lucas's genetic test results, HLA-B27 mutation, only seen in the family of the main perpetrator of the Blue Moon robbery. I squeezed my phone. On that stormy night 30 years ago, when the robbers pierced Edward's father's throat with an icicle, the diamond totem on the armband finally found its bloodline in this adopted son. Claire has made some moves. Lena lowered her voice and put the phone back into her pocket. She contacted an assistant minister of the Department of Justice through her private lawyer, and is willing to plead guilty to the crime of assisting in the fabrication of a kidnapping in exchange for 10 years in prison. The condition is, she glanced at Lucas, hand him over as the principal offender. Lucas stood at the entrance to the fire escape with his back to us. His shadow was stretched out by the light, like a string that was about to break. "Detective Jane." Dr. Isabel walked out of the ward with a pen in the pocket of her white coat. There was a coffee stain on the pen cap, the same as when she tested Edward's blood sugar 3 days ago. She pressed a brass key into my hand. It was so cold, it pricked my hand. "Edward asked me to give it to you. He said that only you can unlock the last secret." "How is he now?" "Not an hour." She pointed downstairs. "The key is to the Van Horn basement. The combination is the date of your father's retirement. He said you would understand. I stared at the patina in the teeth of the key, and suddenly remembered what Edward had said last week in the Van Horn living room, as he stared at the picture of my father, old man. It turns out that he had long regarded me as a bridge connecting the past and the present. Lucas followed me into the Van Horn elevator. When the combination lock opened with a click, his breathing suddenly became heavy. The musty smell of the basement mixed with the smell of old book pages poured out. The safe was embedded in the wall, and the metal surface was covered with a thin layer of dust. The moment I turned the key, I heard Lucas gasp. There were 30 hardcover account books neatly arranged in the safe, with the covers arranged neatly by year. The top one was dated 1993, the year of the Blue Moon robbery, and Edward's father's signature was still clear on the title page. Further down were records of overseas account transfers, tampered pharmacist receipts for insulin pens, and even a copy of the code Claire had written to the robbers 20 years ago. The edges of each page were marked with timelines in red pen, like a sharp knife, cutting through all disguises. The last note was pressed at the bottom. Edward's handwriting was crooked. It should have been written after the kidnapping. The truth is not used to punish people, but to prevent it from happening again. Jane, you are willing to remember it, so you are a witness. I pulled out my cell phone and found Margaret's number. She is an investigative reporter for the New York Times, and was warned by the FBI 3 days ago not to touch the Van Horn case.
It can be published now, I said into the phone. I'll have someone send over all the original documents.
Margaret was silent for 2 seconds on the other end, and then there was the sound of keyboard typing. I need half an hour to prepare the front page. When he hung up the phone, Chen Guang had already climbed onto the safe. I closed the last ledger and suddenly noticed that Lucas was staring at the 1993 book, his fingers gently running over the photocopy of the robber's fingerprints, the same pattern as the index finger of his right hand, exactly the same. Your mother's Daisy. I pointed to the totem on his sleeve. She left it to you, right? He didn't say anything, just nodded. When we returned to the police station, it was already daybreak. I walked towards the evidence room, carrying the cardboard box containing the documents. As I passed the tea room, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass. Half of the puzzle book was sticking out from my coat pocket, and the cover was a familiar beige color. It wasn't until I put the last piece of evidence into a sealed bag and was about to take out the puzzle book to check the list that I realized something was wrong. The corners of this book were even more worn, and there was a note inside the page with unfamiliar handwriting. Thank you for your witness. The real puzzle has just begun. My hand holding the note was shaking slightly. The sirens outside the window suddenly sounded like a sharp needle, piercing the tranquility of the early morning. When I put the cardboard box on the iron table in the evidence room, the fingerprint lock had just made its last beep. The scissors used to remove the seal got stuck in the third glue mark, and the puzzle book suddenly slipped out of my pocket. Something was wrong. As I bent over to pick it up, my fingertips brushed against the cover. The edges that were once polished to a shine are now rough and prickly, and the notepaper clipped inside rustles, with the words like rusty thumbtacks. Thank you for your witness. The real puzzle has just begun. A layer of cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I was flipping through the notebook while holding the note, and half a piece of silver metal fell out from the interlayer. It was an old-fashioned recorder, and the switch button was covered with dust. The moment I pressed the play button, my father's voice exploded on my eardrums. If you hear this recording, it means they have already taken action. Jane, don't believe the evidence you see. They want the witness to disappear. The phone was vibrating and getting hot in my trouser pocket. Margaret's message popped up. The photo was blurry but dazzling. In the bottom compartment of the ransom box, a silver device was wrapped with red wires, and the digital display screen jumped. I just unboxed it and found it. She gasped in her voice. The trigger mechanism is connected to the video playback progress bar. When I edited it and clicked publish, it exploded. The box is in the B3 parking lot of the Times building. Jane, I need you. Send me the location, I interrupted, grabbing my coat and rushing out the door. Lena's car was parked in front of the police station, with FBI documents piled on the passenger seat. The bomb disposal team will be here in 5 minutes. She tossed me the key. Elliot said this bomb uses a chemical fuse that was discarded from the laboratory 30 years ago. There are no more than 3 people in New York who can defuse it. My dad is the 4th. I stepped on the accelerator and the tires scraped the curb as I sped away. Elliot's phone rang at this time, and the background sound was the hum of laboratory instruments. Old-fashioned fuses require specific acid-base neutralizers. The formula is in the archives of the Blue Moon Project. Jane, your father's notes. I swerved the steering wheel, and the car rushed into an old Brooklyn neighborhood. My father's old study was locked. When I used evidence pliers to pry open the lock, a musty smell mixed with the smell of old book pages came out. At the innermost part of the 3rd shelf, the brown paper bag from the Blue Moon robbery case is still there. I shook out the yellowed notes, and a hand-drawn circuit diagram fell out from between the pages. Next to it was crookedly written, neutralizer ratio, 3 ammonium nitrate, 1 hydrochloric acid, and below it was a string of numbers, 1993-0815, my father's birthday. Hello? I heard my own panting when the call was connected. Has it been dismantled? His voice sounded like an old record. The fuse code is 1993-0815. Mix the neutralizer according to the proportion in the notes. You knew they would use this. My hands were shaking as I held the notes. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Silence flows through the current. I just want you to live, he said. During the Blue Moon robbery, it was Claire who gave the robbers the combination of Edward's father's safe. What she wanted was not the money, but the design drawings of those diamonds. Dad, I yelled at him. Now is not the time to talk about this. Go save Margaret. He hung up. The bomb disposal team's explosion-proof suits were reflecting light in the parking lot. When I rushed over, the bomb disposal expert was holding a spray bottle of neutralizer. The password is correct. He wiped his sweat. The digital screen jumped to 0000000. Margaret's report went live the moment the bomb was defused. I stood at the door of the newsroom, the headline on the big screen hurting my eyes. The diamond heist behind the Van Horn kidnapping. A reckoning across 2 generations. The phone vibrates. The text message was sent from an unfamiliar number. Do you think it's over? The real storm has just begun. I held the phone in my palm and turned to walk towards the underground garage. Lucas was sitting in the interrogation room when the iron door of the detention center clanged shut behind him. He looked up at me, the daisy totem on his cuffs glowing faintly under the cold light. This time even his breathing was light, like a piece of glass that could shatter at any time. Tell me about it. I pulled out a chair. Why is your mother's daisy and the Blue Moon robber's emblem exactly the same? He stared at the surveillance camera behind me. His Adam's apple moved, but in the end he said nothing. But I know the answer lies somewhere darker. The elevator of the detention center made a ding sound on the 2nd floor below ground. I touched the recorder in my coat pocket. The metal shell hurt my palm. This was my 3rd interrogation of Lucas Van Horn. The one-way glass in the interrogation room was covered with a thin layer of dust. When I pushed the door open, he was staring at the clock on the wall, his knuckles resting on his chin. The last time we met, he was wearing a beige sweater, but now he was wearing a blue and white striped prison uniform with his cuffs buttoned neatly to his wrists. Mr. Van Horn, I threw the file bag on the table, and the metal buckle clicked. Can you tell me about the diamond totem on your cuff? He raised his eyes, his pupils like glass beads dipped in cold water. Do you know what it really means? I didn't respond. The file bag contained surveillance screenshots copied by the technical department on the night of the standoff in the warehouse. His sleeves were turned up when he raised his gun, and the silver totem flashed blindingly under the light. He suddenly raised his right hand. hooked his fingertips on the cuff, and slowly rolled it up. The skin showed from under the fabric of the prison uniform. The wrist bones protruded, and the veins were like thin blue-gray lines. There was a dark red scar running across the inside of his forearm, until his elbow. It was shaped like a diamond burned by a branding iron, with wrinkles on the edges. "This is the mark left by my father," he said in a low voice. "In the robbery 30 years ago, the masterminds used a red-hot diamond mold to brand his men." I took out a pen and started scratching on the puzzle book. A red circle automatically popped up in the notebook. Lucas's age didn't match. When the robbery happened 30 years ago, his father was at most 20 years old. Where did he have those subordinates who could be branded with scars? "Who is your father?" I asked. He didn't answer but stared at the red circle jumping on my notebook. "Detective Jane. Do you always trust these machines?" Sweat broke out on the back of my neck. This was the first time that my trick was revealed during an interrogation. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text message from Isabel. "Come to the medical room. We have a new discovery." The white coats in the medical room were draped over the backs of the chairs, and the smell of disinfectant made people's noses sore. Isabel slapped a test report on the table and poked at the biomarker column with her fingertips. "There is a special protein from the Blue Moon Project in his blood. This substance only exists in the bodies of family members who participated in the project that year." She pulled her nurse's cap and said, "I found it when I tested Edward's insulin last week. You wanted to wait until things got out of hand before selling it for a good price." I finished her sentence. Isabel's face turned pale instantly. "Project Blue Moon is an old case my father mentioned. In the 1980s, the FBI and jewelers launched a secret operation, ostensibly to combat smuggling, but in reality to launder illegal diamonds using a thief-on-thief approach." I dug out my father's old notes. The names of the people who participated in the family back then were circled in red pen, with Van Horn written at the top. When he returned to the interrogation room, Roy was leaning against the corridor wall, holding a brown paper bag in his hand. He traded in his wrinkled negotiator suit for a crisp FBI uniform. "Birth records." He tossed the bag to me. "Brooklyn ghetto identity." I dug out the documents inside. The father's column on the birth certificate reads Joseph Crane. This name also appears in my father's notes, and he is the missing robber leader in the Blue Moon Project. He is Joseph's grandson. I looked up. Roy nodded. He is the only direct descendant who survived. Joseph's son was killed by Van Horn's men to protect him, and his body was sunk in the East River. I rushed into the interrogation room, holding the documents. Lucas still had his sleeves rolled up, and his scar looked like a river of solidified blood under the cold white light. "Do you know your own background?" I slapped the document in front of him. He smiled. The fine lines at the corners of his eyes looked like they were cut by a knife. "Of course I know. I'm here to finish what my grandfather didn't finish." He tapped the file bag on the table with his knuckles. "The robbery wasn't for money. The Van Horn family used the Blue Moon Project to monopolize the market and laundered black diamonds into charitable donations. My grandfather wanted to expose them. So you staged your own kidnapping." It's true that Edward transferred assets and adjusted the insulin dosage. He suddenly leaned closer. But it's also true that I changed the ransom demand. I want him to disclose the truth about the robbery. He tugged at the collar of his prison uniform. "Why do you think I chose to meet in the warehouse? The third floor underground is the Van Horn family's black account library. The autopsy report stuck to the bottom of the ransom box that Claire pushed was put there by me." I took a half step back. All the red circles on the puzzle book suddenly disappeared, and the completion rate of the clues jumped to 9. The phone rang again. Harold's number bounced on the screen. I pressed the answer button, and his voice was like lead. "Now you understand why we must stop him." "Stop what?" "Stop the truth from being exposed." I stared at Lucas on the other side of the glass. He was tracing the scar with his fingertips, as if stroking some kind of belief. Harold was silent. I hung up the phone and heard my heart beat over the hum of the vents. As dusk drifted into the interrogation room, I closed the puzzle book. On the last blank page, I wrote Lucas Van Horn. The ink smudged into a small blob on the page. Lena was still chewing gum when she answered the phone. Are you going to make a big move again? We need a new strategy. I looked out the window at the darkening sky. About Project Blue Moon, about Van Horn, about your father. Lena suddenly lowered her voice. My grip on the phone tightened. My father's grave is in Brooklyn Cemetery. When I visited the grave last week, I found a rusty iron box under the tombstone. There was an unopened letter inside. The handwriting on the envelope was very familiar to me. It was my father's handwriting in fountain pen. Accompany me to the cemetery tomorrow, I whispered. The wind outside the window lifted up the puzzle book, and the name on the last page was rustling loudly. Chapter 18. Father's Testimony Tipping Point. I squatted on the floor of my father's study, old sawdust sticking to my fingernails. When the last loose wooden board was pried open by a screwdriver, a brown leather envelope fell out with a click. The edges were worn and rough, and the postmark date was November 15th, 2003, the month when the Blue Moon Project investigation was nearing its end. When the letter was unfolded, a speck of dust floated down, and my father's penmanship was so powerful that it could be seen through the paper. If I die, please give this testimony to someone you think can bear the truth. The ink spread on the word death, like a drop of solidified blood. I suddenly remembered the last time he worked the night shift before his retirement, and the strange smell of perfume on his shirt collar. I also remembered the man in sunglasses at his funeral, who stood in front of the tombstone for 3 minutes, and then hurried away. It turns out that he knew he would be silenced. The cell phone vibrated in my pocket, and Margaret's name popped up. I slapped the letter on the coffee table and answered the phone. Can you arrange a special report? It's not a kidnapping case. It's the Blue Moon Project. The timeline, the names of suspects, and evidence of corruption among the top officials of the FBI and the police department. The sound of pages turning on the other end of the phone stopped. Are you sure? Her voice was so soft as if she was afraid of shattering glass. I reached for the coffee cup on the coffee table, and my father's fingerprints were still on the wall of the cup. My father left me this responsibility. 3 hours later, Margaret showed up at my apartment, her camera bag squeaking against the doorframe. She stared at the signature on the letter for 10 minutes, then suddenly looked up and said, 20 years ago, I interviewed your father, and he said, some truths bite your hand. She pushed the micro recorder over to her. Now tell me, are you ready to be bitten back? I opened the drawer and pulled out my father's FBI badge. The metal edge hurt his palm. He didn't say it, but I guess he's ready to be bitten back. Lena arrived at 10 o'clock at night, carrying a silver briefcase. She put the scanner on the table, revealing a half-empty box of chewing gum at the bottom of the box. The original notes must be backed up anonymously. I have contacted 3 overseas servers. She flipped through her father's yellowed manuscript, and the tip of her fountain pen paused on the name Harold Black, U Director, and the current Assistant Director of the FBI, Senator. I pointed to the name circled 7 times, in red in my notes. My dad wrote that they used the Blue Moon Project to launder black diamonds into charity funds, and the Van Horn family was the white glove. Lena's scanner gun made a beep sound. This is not an investigation. This is a trial. She pushed the last page of notes into the scanner. I'll have someone clear the server logs at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Harold knocked on the door at 3 in the morning. He was not wearing a police uniform, but a faded sweater, looking like an ordinary retired old man. Jane, do you know how many people this will ruin? His voice was like cotton soaked in warm water. Your father chose to remain silent because he knew that there were some things cannot be changed. I interrupted him, slapping my father's letter in front of him. But when he wrote this letter, he was ready for the truth to change. His fingers paused on the letter for 2 seconds, and he suddenly laughed. "You are really like your father. You always think you can be a hero." When he stood up, he knocked over the mug on the coffee table, and the coffee left a dark circle on the floor. "But your father has already experienced the hero's end." After the door slammed, I squatted down to wipe the coffee stain. The photo of my father was reflected in the water stain. He was wearing an FBI uniform, his mouth pursed, the same expression he had when he looked at those cold case files when I was growing up in the evidence room. The report went live at 7 in the morning. I stared at the screen of my phone. The first comment was, "Is the Van Horn kidnapping case just the tip of the iceberg?" The second was, "Former FBI agent's surviving daughter reveals shocking secrets." And the third one started to fill the screen with demanding a thorough investigation. On TV news, the mayor was wiping sweat at a press conference. The top 20 most popular topics on social media were all Blue Moon Project. The FBI's official Weibo account issued a statement saying a special task force has been established, but the accompanying picture was blank. I sat in my office, listening to the noise of reporters downstairs. The puzzle book on the table was open, with Lucas Van Horn written on the last page, and copies of his father's notes were densely pasted next to it. The sun shone through the window, making the words Harold Black glow.
Detective Jian. Intern Xiaokai poked his head in. "The chief asked you to go to his office."
I closed the puzzle book, and the metal clasp made a crisp click sound. The last red circle completely disappeared between the pages, like snow melted by the sun. The sirens outside the window are getting closer. I stood in front of the office window, my blue face reflected in the glass. Reporters in front of the New York Times building downstairs were holding cameras, and protesters were holding signs that read, "Thoroughly investigate Blue Moon," like a ball of burning fire. My phone was vibrating so hard in my trouser pocket that it hurt. I took it out, and a message from an anonymous number popped up. "I can tell you what your father didn't finish." The attached photo is a bookshelf in my father's study. The book History of American Judiciary was pulled out, revealing a hole in the wall behind it. When I went through the study last week, his old pocket watch was still stuck in the hole, engraved with to John Marlowe. It's empty now. "Jane," Margaret's phone rang over me, her breathing like a bellows. "There's a package in our newspaper parking lot. The recipient is you, but there's no sender." I heard the rustling of the plastic bag. It's an old photo album. The cover has secrets of the Van Horn family in gold foil. I clutched my phone tightly, turned to the middle. "Wait," she gasped. "There's a note inside. The paper is all yellowed. It says the real kidnapper is still alive." My throat tightened. The words Blue Moon Project in his father's notebook suddenly flashed before his eyes, and the hero's end that Harold mentioned in the early morning also popped up in his mind. This is not a threat. It's a thread being handed to you. Lena rushed in 20 minutes later, wearing white gloves. She pinched the edge of the album and placed a magnifying glass on the footer. There are trace amounts of radioactive markers left. She looked up, her pupils shrinking to the size of pinpoints. It's used for tracking internal government documents. The FBI phased it out 10 years ago. "People in the system," I blurted out. "It could be a survivor of Blue Moon." She put the photo album into the evidence bag. "Who has disappeared recently?" Isabel Carter's face flashed out. "Edward's personal doctor suddenly resigned last week, saying she was going back to Florida to take care of her mother. But I checked the flight records 3 days ago, and she didn't buy a ticket at all." I pulled out my address book and dialed Roy's number. The phone rang 5 times, and he answered it, with the background noise of electricity. "East River Pier, Section B7, tonight at 10 o'clock. Wear a dark coat." "Why me?" You want to know the answer, enemy or friend. He laughed, like a stone thrown into a deep pool. "I just want the game to continue." After hanging up, I fished out my bulletproof vest from the bottom of my drawer. When I stuffed the puzzle book into the inner pocket, The metal buckle hurt my ribs. Lena helped me adjust the headset. I hacked into the dock surveillance. Margaret is on standby in the safe house. Call if there is anything. At 10 o'clock, I stood in front of the broken iron gate of Area B7. The sound of the tide drowned out the sound of footsteps, and the rusty hinges screamed. The tactical flashlight swept across the warehouse piled with waste wooden boxes, and a figure straightened up in the shadows. Detective Jane. The voice was hoarse and had the sting of laryngitis. I froze. It was Isabel. Her temples were covered in dust. Her white coat had been replaced with an old jacket, and she was holding a tape in her hand. This is my husband's last confession. She took 2 steps forward, and the tape glowed coldly in the flashlight. He said that he knew who was the real culprit in the diamond robbery 30 years ago. I reached out to take it. Her fingers were like ice cubes, pressing on the back of my hand. The black diamonds used by Blue Moon to launder money were picked up by Old Man Van Horn from the robbery scene. She suddenly coughed, and blood foam splashed on the tape. But the real robber, Isabel. There were hurried footsteps outside the warehouse. She suddenly let go, turned around and ran into the darkness. I took 2 steps after it and only caught half of the photo that had fallen to the ground. It was a young Edward hugging a man in a leather jacket, with the old Manhattan Pier behind him. Lena shouted in the earphone, "Jane, there are 3 unlicensed cars outside the dock." I stuffed the tape into my vest and headed in the opposite direction. The wind blew into my collar, and the puzzle piece pressed against my skin, causing pain. The desk light in the safe house was still on, and Margaret must be making coffee. But at this moment, with the waves of the East River lapping at my feet, I suddenly understood. Edward's kidnapping case was just a lifted brick. When I got back to the safe house, the tape was still warm. Margaret handed over a cup of hot cocoa, with water droplets condensing on the walls of the cup. I stared at the cassette player on the table, the metal buttons glowing coldly under the overhead light. "Want to listen now?" she asked. I took out the puzzle book and turned to the latest page. Isabel Carter was written in a red circle with half a photo next to it. The pen paused on the words "real robber," and the ink spread out into a small ball. "Wait." I looked up. "Check the tape first to see if there's a tracker." Margaret nodded and turned to get the testing equipment. I held the cassette in my hand. The blood stains on the plastic shell had dried, leaving a dark red scar. Outside the window, the sound of sirens came closer and closer, mixed with the sound of the East River's tide buzzing in my ears. There's always a voice saying that the real eye of the storm is in this tape.
On the other end of the phone, Lena was silent for a few seconds, and then said decisively,
I hung up the phone. The morning light had penetrated the mist in the cemetery and shone on me, bringing a hint of warmth.
My father's tombstone looked particularly cold in the morning light. I didn't look at it again, turned around and walked away step by step. The calm is real, but beneath the calm is a storm that is about to rise. I know that from the moment I said, "Let the world know the truth." My life, or rather, my father's life, that has not yet been completely forgotten, will be completely changed. Lena's efficiency is amazing. Instead of choosing the mainstream media, she contacted an independent investigative news platform known for its courageous revelations. In her words, only a madman would dare to take on such a task, and only a madman could accomplish it. We met at an inconspicuous cafe. Lena brought the editor-in-chief of the platform, a middle-aged man with black-framed glasses and sharp eyes, codenamed Old K. I gave him a copy of the tape and a copy of the agreement. Old K didn't ask any more questions. He just carefully checked the paperlint on the document and listened to several recordings repeatedly. Your father, he put down his headphones and looked at me, is a tough guy. I smiled bitterly. He is just an ordinary person who chose to remain silent and was involved in an extraordinary thing. Ordinary people? Old K raised his eyebrows. Ordinary people cannot sign this level of confidentiality agreement, let alone be just an aftermath in an incident of the magnitude of the Blue Moon Project. Your father's role in it is probably even deeper than what is said in the recording. My heart tightened. Yes, Isabel's husband is just a forensic doctor. He only sees the tip of the iceberg. My father had access to original evidence and was able to destroy files. His position and authority meant that his role was far more than just cleaning up the mess. This recording and this agreement are just the detonator, said Lauka. We need more evidence and to dig deeper. Are you ready? Once it's activated, you and your father's name will be put under the spotlight. I looked at the busy traffic outside the window. Everyone was in a hurry, running for their lives. Once upon a time, I was one of them, thinking that I was pursuing simple truth and justice. I have nothing to lose, I said, except a false reputation and a past wrapped in lies. Kay nodded. Okay. Lena, you follow up. We need all your father's colleagues and superiors who may have come into contact with the Blue Moon Project, and even every seemingly insignificant case he was in charge of. No clues can be missed. Lena agreed solemnly. In the days that followed, I felt like I was living in the eye of a storm. While the outside world was calm and peaceful as usual, my world was secretly turning upside down. Lena and Lauka's team began an in-depth investigation. They started with my father's old friends and colleagues, and even looked through all the public information and non-public files that might be related to the Blue Moon Project in those years. I locked myself in the safe house and listened to the recording over and over again. Every time my father's name came out of the mouth of that strange forensic doctor, it felt like a blunt knife cutting my heart. I began to recall every detail of my father's life. He was always taciturn and felt deeply guilty about my mother's early death. He rarely talks about his work, especially his experiences as a young man. I always thought that it was the low-key and reserved nature of the soldiers, but now I think it was more like a deliberate avoidance and concealment. Did he ever think about speaking it out, but ultimately chose to take everything to the grave because of some concerns or some kind of deal? I even began to wonder if my mother's death was also related to the Blue Moon Project. This thought came to my mind and grew like a vine. A week later, Lena brought back preliminary findings. The situation is more complicated than we thought. Her face was solemn. Your father was not only the aftermath of the Blue Moon Project, he was one of the core members. That agreement was not just a gag order to destroy evidence, but more like a pledge of allegiance. A letter of surrender. Yes. We found out that your father's position was rapidly promoted shortly after signing the agreement. Moreover, the real person in charge of the Blue Moon Project is not Edward or Claire. They are more like pawns in front of the stage. The person behind the scenes, we haven't found out his specific identity yet, but all the clues point to a code name. Ghost? The word makes me shudder. Yes. Also, the medical examiner reported the cause of death of Isabel's husband as sudden heart attack, but we found some suspicious points. His death was probably not an accident. I felt dizzy. This means that not only was my father involved in covering up the truth, he may even have been indirectly or directly involved in a life. Also, Lena paused, her tone becoming more difficult. Your mother, we found out that she had received a period of secret psychological treatment shortly after you were born. The treatment records are classified as top secret, so we cannot access them for the time being. My heart sank to the bottom. It turns out that what I thought was the end was just another starting point. The image of my father completely collapsed in my mind, and then was pieced back together in a more complex and darker way. Old K decided that the first report will be sent out next Monday. Lena looked at me. He asked me to ask you if you have anything to add, or if you want to quit now. It's not too late. I looked out the window. The sky gradually darkened and the neon lights of the city began to flicker like countless pairs of prying eyes. Quit? No. If my father chooses to remain silent, then I must choose to speak. Not only for Isabel's husband, for all the innocent people devoured by the Blue Moon Project, but also for my father, whom I never really understood, and myself. Tell Lauko. I took a deep breath, my voice calm but firm. I have nothing to add. Proceed as planned. Let everyone see who the ghost is, and what the Blue Moon Project is. Lena nodded. Okay, be careful. This pool of water is deeper than the sea. I know, but I've already jumped. That's the end of tonight's story. Thank you for listening. Have a good sleep. Good night, dear wanderer.